Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Surrey Board of Trade. I am Rona Doria, Events and Sponsorship Coordinator of the Surrey Board of Trade. I want to welcome you to today's Digital Impact Learning Lab, introducing bullying and harassment policies in your organization. I wanted to remind you that if you have any questions during this session, please put them on the chat function and we will get back to them as soon as we can. If we are unable to answer your questions, we will get back to you as soon as the session is over. I acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Quiquetlam, Kakite, Semiahmoo, and Tuasin First Nations. As well, I acknowledge the Inuit and Métis Nations peoples who live and work on these territories. The Surrey Board of Trade is a Surrey City building business organization where we support business and bring business into the city. We are here to advocate for you to instigate change at different levels of government and to be your concierge of connections. Check out our diversified portfolio at businessinsurrey.com. I am pleased to introduce your facilitators this morning, Mandie La Montagne, CPHR and Managing Director of the Intueri Group, and Catalina Rodriguez, Employment Lawyer, Mediator, Facilitator, and Investigator at Forte Workplace Law. Catalina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rona. I am also a proud business person in Surrey, and our law firm Forte Workplace Law is located in South Surrey, and I'm delighted to be here and to talk about introducing bullying and harassment policies in your organization, which is a topic that I understand came from the membership as something that they wanted to know about. So let's get started with the basics, which, Mandie, next slide, please. Thank you. Let's get started with the basics, which is why do you need a policy? So some of you in the audience may already have a policy, some of you may not. And it's important to go to the why. So I start with you need one because it's the right thing to do in order to prevent bullying and harassment. There is an impact of bullying and harassment. And if any of you in the audience has been at the receiving end or has observed someone being at the receiving end of bullying and harassment, this is a given, right? You know what the impact is. But I'll tell you what the research says that the impact is. Christine Porath is a woman that became very popular because she has a TED Talk called The Cost of Incivility, The Cost of Incivility. Has been watched by millions of people, but she also wrote a book, and I read the book, and the book is fascinating. Ms. Porath took 1,000 Fortune companies in the United States and looked at the impact of disrespect in the workplace, in pockets of the organization. Executives in the 1,000 Fortune companies spend an hour of 7 weeks per year dealing with incidents of bullying and harassment. You can translate that into dollars of executive time. Her research also uncovers things that are going to be common sense to all of you. People are taking stress leaves, sick leaves, lack of productivity, lack of creativity, right? And all of you business owners out there know creativity is key for innovation. Innovation is key to staying alive as a company. So again, direct cost of bullying and harassment and your ability to succeed as a company. One interesting find, there is a transfer of aggression to the customers. So a festering toxic environment ends up affecting how your people serve your customers. So very important. Next slide. Thank you, Mandie. Now, there's also a compliance issue and a practical issue as to why you need a policy that addresses bullying and harassment. The practical issue, the policy becomes your guidance, right? When you're dealing with one of these incidents, you have a document that tells you how do you respond to them. It also tells your employees what the expectations are, right? So the definition of unfairness, in my opinion, is to be held to a standard that you were never made aware of, right? So the policy is going to make your people aware of what the standards are. And it's going to make your people aware of what is bullying, what is harassment, what is discrimination, and what do you do if you're at the receiving end of it. Now, there's a compliance issue. And this one is, of course, what I focus on too, because as a lawyer, that's the type of questions I receive all the time. It's like, why do I need to do this? What happens if I don't? So the Workers' Compensation Act has a set of regulations, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Regulation. And under those regulations, WorkSafe BC has issued policy item P221.2. You don't have to memorize this, it doesn't matter. The point is that under that policy, you as an employer have a clear and positive obligation to prevent bullying and harassment in the workplace and to investigate incidents of bullying and harassment when they occur and to have a policy. I have had employer clients who do not have a policy. They have an issue of bullying and harassment. They have called me to investigate, and inevitably they also get a phone call from WorkSafe BC saying, guys, where's your policy and what are you doing? Yeah. Now, we're about to cover what needs to be the content of your policy. Now, from a compliance issue perspective, there's also the Human Rights Code in British Columbia. And if the type of harassment that happened in your workplace is discriminatory harassment, in other words, it's harassment based on a protected ground of the Human Rights Code. In other words, someone's being harassed because of the color of their skin, their place of origin, their ancestry, their sexual orientation. Under the Human Rights Code, you also have an obligation to investigate that. Because if that employee files a human rights complaint, you have no way of defending yourself. Your defense is Human Rights Tribunal, here's my investigation and here's the consequences. Here's the discipline I imposed, or here's the person who lost their job. I've done my part. Yeah. Under employment law, you can only terminate someone for cause after you have determined that you have cause to terminate someone. And in order to determine that you have cause, you need to have investigated carefully and thoroughly an event. So I'm happy to take questions on that, but from a compliance perspective, as an organization, you also need a policy that tells you how to deal with this incident. Now, what needs to be in the policy? If you find the template that WorkSafe BC has online, you're going to be fine, right? This is not overly complicated. Now, if you find that template, make sure that you customize it so it speaks to your people and it speaks your language, yeah? And it speaks the language of your organization. This is typically what needs to be in the policy. Set the expectation. People, this is what you are not allowed to do, okay? So start there. Second, define the terms, right? What is bullying? Bullying is inappropriate conduct that the person knew or should have known would result in humiliation or intimidation, right? The person knew or should have known would result in intimidation or humiliation. So it's a high burden that the law places on humans in the workplace. You knew or should have known this would result in humiliation or intimidation to someone. Define what discrimination is. What is discrimination? Is adverse consequence or negative consequence at work based on a protected characteristic under the Human Rights Code. Very easy example of discrimination. I wasn't hired because I am Latina. Easy. I was not promoted because I am a woman. Easy. Yeah. Define what sexual harassment is. Unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Right? So easy sexual harassment. You sleep with me, otherwise you won't get promoted. Easy example. Right? All those definitions need to be there. And you need to provide examples so that it lands with people. Your policy also needs to set out the responsibilities. So who is going to receive a concern of bullying, harassment, or discrimination? Who is going to investigate it? Who is going to impose consequences? What are your manager's obligations specifically? Yeah. It also needs to outline an escalation process, right? So that people clearly know what to do. and it needs to explain how you're going to investigate issues of bullying and harassment. Okay? Now, it also needs to set out your commitment to remedies and consequences. In other words, once this is investigated, you're not just going to put it in the drawer, you're going to do something about it, right? And Mandie and I are very much aware that remedies and consequences are not always ideal or what the parties expected or what the parties wanted, but it's sometimes the only thing that you can do, right? So to give you an example, I bullied Mandie. My organization investigated. Turns out, yes, I knew or should have known that the things I've been saying to Mandie would be intimidating or threatening to her, but they were not so serious that I need to lose my job. But I get a final written warning and my job's on the line. And on Monday morning, I go down the hall and there's Mandie, right? And your organization is a small organization. There's nowhere to put me, right? I work on reception, Mandie works in the back room, and inevitably we're going to meet in the kitchen. Yeah. So that's where teaching your people about conflict resolution is super important, and teaching yourselves about conflict resolution. Now, next slide, please, Mandie. And I see a question from the audience. Where and how can employees complain about bullying and or harassment incidents inside and outside the organization? So inside the organization, they can complain through the mechanisms that are in your policy. In the absence of the policy, they need to complain to management, right? And management needs to know what to do. Outside of the organization, WorkSafe BC or the human rights complaint if it is discriminatory harassment. Don't forget, WorkSafe BC, they always start by giving the employer a phone call and say, hey, we received a call from Mandie. She's been feeling bullied and harassed in the workplace, and she feels that you guys are not doing anything. What are you guys doing? That's where WorkSafe BC will start. Show me your policy. Where is your policy? And they want to see compliance. You have an opportunity to start complying at that stage. Now, your policy also needs to say what is not bullying and harassment. For instance, reasonable actions by an employer to manage the workplace. So while it is intimidating and threatening when Rona is doing my performance review and she's telling me that I'm not meeting goals or expectations, and I find that humiliating and threatening, it is not bullying and harassment because it is not improper conduct. It's Rona being my boss. So you need to spell that out in the policy so that managers can do their job of managing the work. Being asked to participate in an investigation of an incident of bullying and harassment is not bullying and harassment. Does it feel intimidating and threatening? Yes, it does. But the management needs to be able to do their job, and therefore that's not improper conduct, doesn't fall within the definition. You need to address consensual relationships. Why do I suggest this? Because people usually meet, or in many occasions, meet their significant others at work. And having a lovely relationship that starts with attraction, turns into dating, we're all very happy. There's nothing wrong with that. But when there is a power imbalance, there might be a risk that there is no consent. I go back to the definition of sexual harassment. Unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Unwelcome is the first element, right? And in order to know whether conduct of a sexual nature is welcomed or not, if you have a power imbalance, it's very hard to establish. So if I work in the reception desk at a dentistry office, and the dentist who's the owner of the practice starts chatting me up and wants to see me for drinks afterwards, I may not feel like I have the ability to say no because my job's on the line. And then there's a lack of consent when I say yes. And that's where troubles begin. You know, and this could be the subject of a whole seminar. We can do a whole seminar on sexual harassment. Okay? You need to address it in your policy. Now, I wanted to focus on the escalation process that needs to be addressed in your policy, right? The first thing your policy needs to invite people to do is to speak to the person directly whose conduct is bothering me, right? So, Rana, I did not appreciate the conversation we had on the hallway the other day. It made me feel intimidated and threatened. Can we please have that conversation in a different manner or anything like that? Now, if those conversations were easy to have, if talking to someone who has offended you was an easy thing, we would have world peace. We don't have world peace for a reason, because this is the hardest thing you can do. At work, at home, with your family, with your significant others, with your friends, yeah? So the question I have for all of you is, you need to train your people on how to have difficult conversations at work, right? It's one of the most helpful skills you can provide as an employer of people and for yourself. Through our Forte Workplace Law has a training and development branch that we call stand-up teams. And it's called stand-up teams because we focus on bystander intervention for respecting the workplace. But as part of that training, we give you, I want to say, in order to say it easily, the tips and tricks of how to have a difficult conversation. It might change your life. It has changed mine. Now, the policy also needs to tell people who to talk to if they see bullying, harassment, or discrimination, or if they're at the receiving end. And the who to talk to first instance is the person's manager. Yeah. Now, are your managers, or are you as a business owner ready to know what to do when you receive this hot potato Monday morning? Right? So perhaps you need to train your managers on the appropriate response and what their specific responsibilities are, because they represent the employee. The policy also needs to talk about how else people can report issues of bullying and harassment. And this goes back to the question that was posed in the chat. So Munib, thank you. You were the one who posted. If your organization is large enough and you have an HR department, you need to state in the policy how you can notify HR. Directly, via phone call, here's the email. If your organization is large enough that you can have a 1-800 line, you may want to offer a 1-800 line so people can report anonymously when they feel they need to. Yeah. If you are an organization where the only management person is you, then you are it. You are the person who's going to have to handle these things. Now, what to do when the concern of bullying and harassment gets to you? Your policy needs to talk about how you're going to investigate it. And for large, sophisticated organizations, HR typically investigates these issues. For very sophisticated organizations, there's a team of employee relations folks or an investigators team. For small organizations, it might have to be you, right? Again, it may have to be management. And you need to know the basic principles of how to conduct an investigation. The first one is confidentiality. What's happening in that dispute needs to be known only as needed. The second principle is procedural fairness, which means that as an investigator, you always listen to both sides of the story, always, and that you document the fact that you listen to both sides of the story. By both sides of the story, I mean the two people in the conflict need to have an opportunity to share with you what happened, what they recall, what they remember, to present to you any text messages or emails. All of that you need to consider. You need to be able to assess credibility. The he said, she said situations happen quite often. Mandie says, I wasn't in the office that day. Catalina says, of course you were, and that was exactly the day in which you screamed at me at the kitchen and called me a racial slur. So who's telling the truth? You need to make an assessment of credibility. If there's nothing in the calendars that indicate whether one of them was out of the office or not. And you need to determine what is more likely than not to have happened before you impose the appropriate consequence and remedy. So I asked the question, if you have an HR team, are they ready? If it's you who's doing it, are you ready? Right? And of course, I'll pitch that Our firm also offers training for how to conduct workplace investigations. We recently did that for a post-secondary education institution, which is large and sophisticated, and they wanted their HR people to be trained on how to do this. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catalina. As an HR professional, I think what you've just provided to everyone is an awesome reminder with some really good insights. Even if you do this every day, sometimes we can forget some of the nuances. So it's really important to stay current and to stay on top of the information and certainly to participate in informative sessions like this, just so we know what's expected of us as an employer, as a manager, as an employee, or even as an HR professional. So thanks very much for passing the baton over. I'm excited to be working with you on this presentation, I have to say, because it's an area of practice where you don't want to feel alone. You want to know that you have someone else in your corner that you can work with to effectively support and advocate for everyone who is involved in one of these situations, whether you're introducing a new policy, whether you're working through an investigation related to harassment or bullying claim, or whether you're being proactive in talking about creating structures to respond and react effectively to these situations. 2 heads or 3 heads are always better than 1. So thanks very much. Someone told me a while ago that common sense comes from common practice. And today's workplaces are really diverse, and they're made up of varied experience, perspective, beliefs, and a whole lot of uncommon practice. And I think we need to recognize this and keep it in mind when we're trying to introduce new concepts or new expectations, or even a policy that we believe are pretty straightforward, well laid out, or that people should already know. Right? That common sense isn't necessarily going to equate the same in each individual organization. I think this is where I found through experience that transitioning from what we know we need to do, what Catalina's laid out to us in terms of what the regulations state or what the legislation requires, into something that actually resonates and lands with our workforce, with our talent in our organization, with our unique culture, can be really challenging. How do you take this law or this rule and translate it from paper to people? How can we help them really understand and make it make sense? And so the next couple slides, I want to walk us through some practical aspects of introducing a new bullying and harassment policy into your workplace, or any policy or change for that matter. So the tone from the top, the vision of the leader, is going to determine how successful any organizational change is going to be. And whether that's as simple as introducing a new policy or program or a process, or something much larger, like expanding or growing your business, reorganizing, or even adding new talent or new leadership who may have a completely different view as to where we're going, how we're going to get there, and what is important to us now. And for any change to be effective, it needs to be what I like to call sticky, right? It needs to stay with you. It needs to have that stay with itness, to have a lasting impact and value to the organization, right? You need to look at having buy-in from all of your participants and true acceptance. Otherwise, you run it having the risk of being an issue that can be ignored or waited out or seen as less important than what you might expect. And so to the CEOs, the general managers, the business owners, the boards of directors, the executive leaders, however you identify yourself, it's important that you are leading by example and showing others through your own words and your own actions that the initiative related to introducing a bullying and harassment policy is capital I important, right? Not only to you, but to everyone in the organization. And just because it's legally required or it's mandated doesn't mean that we get to automatically have everybody on board ready and willing to participate. We've got to take a lot of time to understand how we can bring everyone on the same page and how we can communicate in a way that allows them to feel heard, to belong, to feel included, rather than just telling and doing. Hey, this is what we're doing, but we don't have to explain why. We always want to come back to our why we're doing this. And so I like to think about an effective implementation of any policy, including 3 elements. That is, first, your commitment, the commitment from leadership to see that it is done, to ensure that everyone understands. The communication process, communicate, communicate, communicate. And just when you feel like you are over communicating, you're probably coming to the point where it's almost enough. And so repetition here is key. And that leads into the 3rd C, which would be consistency, right? How consistent is your message? How consistent is your approach, right? Are people going to be able to see that this is truly something important and that you have thought it through, as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction? We're getting it done because we were told to. Right? So let's share a couple of best or better practices with you. The first would be being intentional about introducing a new bullying and harassment program. Think about starting with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind and create a communication plan that includes a project timeline. So you have some identified milestones along the way to identify areas of accountability, right? Who's doing what? And personally, a new bullying and harassment policy is not the next HR initiative. It's not their latest and greatest idea. This is an organizational initiative that affects everyone and ideally should be owned by everyone. Everyone plays a role in doing their part to ensure that the organization can become a great place to work with effective strategies for addressing bullying and harassment issues. You want to be inclusive, right? Finding ways to incorporate that diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, all of your different talent individuals to get their perspective on how will this work best in your organization. Okay? Focus groups, task forces, even having project champions or cheerleaders is a great way to start fostering a culture of inclusion and to get other individuals interested in the process so that they help with creating that groundswell and that momentum to move the introduction of a new policy forward. Incent and excite. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to pay people to participate in your bullying and harassment initiatives, but I think you need to consider your current culture. How do you reward and recognize people for participating, for expressing their opinions or their viewpoints? What's your reaction to that? Okay? How do you share information? Are you an environment that sends out regular memos? Do you have town halls? Do you have morning shop talks? How is it that you get ahead of employee questions, providing them all the information that they need, including overcoming challenges that might come up day to day and celebrating success? Right? How are people used to becoming involved in organizational items? I've said here you want to get ahead of employee questions with them. So WIFM is short for what's in it for me? That answers or asks the really big employee question that we all have. Why am I doing this? Why should I care? What kind of benefits are there to me of participating in this new bullying and harassment policy? Can I opt out? Right? It seems like a lot of work. I don't want to be involved in all this training and awareness building. Right? Why should I do this? So it's important that as an organizational leader, you take the time to explain the value and the outcomes associated with this. It's not just compliance, right? It's not just because we said so. It's not because it's a government mandated initiative. It's because it's going to improve your employee experience. It's going to improve your enjoyment of the workplace. It might give you more peace of mind in knowing how to work with others. If you've taken some training or you understand how to resolve some conflict, maybe you've worked with Catalina and the crew to have better, more effective, tough conversations. right? How can I communicate with peers around me in a way that leaves us all feeling better for having that conversation rather than worse or more uncomfortable? So there's some real upside to getting people excited about participating in the introduction of a new policy, even if it's something like bullying and harassment as the title. Okay? And lastly, I want to encourage you to involve others in a regular cycle of feedback. So, pardon me, when you're introducing a new policy, it's not a one and done. We don't get to put it in the binder, up on the shelf, and forget about it. We need to intentionally have a regular practice of review, asking for feedback. Hey, everybody, we introduced a new policy. How's it working? Have we tested it? What's the feedback been? Can we make changes to make it even better? Right? Can we communicate it differently? Maybe we can add another section with a different language if we have a diverse lingual population in the workforce. Can we expand this so that more people have a deeper understanding of what this policy means and how it affects them personally? So you want to get into the habit of regularly improving and tweaking your policy to reflect the nature of your organization. And if not annually, then even more frequently. And certainly as issues come up, using those as an opportunity to question whether or not the policy still stands the way it should. So the medium is the message. This is not a cryptic kind of statement, but what I want to suggest is that the mediums, the methods, the approaches that you use to communicate any new change or any new policy can be as important as that initiative itself. And knowing the communication norms in your company, in your organization, related to your culture, can all contribute to a really successful rollout. And I asked earlier, what is your culture like? How do you share information? How do you celebrate success? How do you overcome challenges? What is the normal practice so that you can build and leverage off of that to have this introduction be equally as successful? I think you want to build a plan that addresses who. Who is going to deliver what messages, right? How are these messages going to be delivered? Are you going to be using an email to send out everything? Will you have town halls? Do you do video conferencing? Will you have small group or large group meetings? Thinking about how you can carefully construct this message to best reach your audience. It's going to be something that you want to give some thought to before you jump in to rolling it out, so that you have a very manageable, reasonable cadence to the introduction of your new policy. Pardon me. You also need to have a really clear understanding of why. Why are you introducing a bullying and harassment policy to begin with? Is it in response to an investigation recommendation? Maybe you didn't have a policy in the past. One of the recommendations from the investigation is that you need to have one. Maybe it's a WorkSafe BC recommendation or directive. In the absence of having something that you're required to have, you now need to put it in place. Or are you introducing one of these policies because, again, you want to build an engaged workforce, you want to have a process by which employees can effectively navigate one of these situations? Consider, for those of you who may have had situations in the past, have those previous incidents or issues been effectively resolved? Or do you still have conflict in the workplace? Do you still have awkwardness? Are Catalina and I still giving each other the eye at the water cooler? Because yes, it's resolved and done, but we still haven't let it go. We haven't moved forward. There's still some office tension. And she and I can feel it, but so can our colleagues around us. They can witness it and they can understand it. So really being aware and sensitive to the relationships of others, to the history, to the lived experience of individuals who are in your workplace. Maybe I haven't had a problem in the workplace, but when I worked with Rona at a previous organization, we had problems. And I have brought that experience into my new workplace. And so I'm a little skeptical about how things are going to work with a bullying and harassment policy here. Maybe my experience from another company wasn't as good as it could have been. So I'm not going to be prepared to participate in this new process. Maybe I'm still a little bit judgy, okay? I think you want to also consider previous initiatives or introductions of other policies or procedures that went well, okay? What made them so effective? What did you do that allowed you to introduce it to the workforce without too many bumps along the way? And conversely, where things didn't go as planned, let's reflect on that. And let's look at the areas that were challenging or the barriers that popped up. Maybe technology wasn't the best way to roll out the new policy. Maybe we didn't have a training facility to include people the way that we wanted to. Maybe looking back, we needed to have an external facilitator bring some objective perspective into the room, as opposed to using one of our internal employees to deliver that same training. That external perspective allowed for a break between what was important and the relationships that existed. I know in my previous experience, having my manager deliver training about a new policy felt uncomfortable to me because they're included in the process that I would then have to follow. Okay, maybe there's a better way to avoid having that discomfort. So that brings us to next steps. How do we take this moving forward? And I think it starts with partnering with others. I said earlier on that I was really pleased to be partnering with Catalina on this delivery because we work together, right? We have the opportunity to partner on understanding our areas of strength and expertise, and then delivering that knowledge collectively back to our clients or anybody that we're working with. So as a business owner, as a small business, even as an HR professional, consider working with, liaising with, bouncing ideas off of another employment lawyer. Creating great relationships with these individuals can help to move it from that client feeling to simply two professionals working together in the best interest and outcome of others. For those that don't have an HR person in-house and where it's the manager managing everything and all of the people and all these challenges, you might want to consider working with an HR consultant or an external individual who can come in on a case-by-case basis, or who can be there to support you part-time on a regular basis. Also, Catalina introduced us to the investigations. And so investigations can be done internally, as she mentioned. You may also have an opportunity and prefer to contract that investigation out. And so there are additional individuals that you can do that, as well as training and facilitating all of the different elements of a new bullying and harassment policy. WorkSafe BC, Catalina led off with the fact that if you have their template and outline, you're really off to a good start. They've provided a lot of useful and helpful information for employers and organizations to use that align really well with their expectations, and that you can adjust and edit and tailor to your own organization. I'm going to end this off with a word of caution because it is all too easy. I do it myself and I have to slap my hand. Oh, what's the answer to this question? I'll just Google it. I'll figure it out. It's easy. 3 or 4 little seconds on the keyboard and you have a plethora of information at your fingertips. But knowing what is credible, what is valid, what is appropriate is another question altogether. You can download free templates online, but how do you know if they're specific to your jurisdiction or your company? Maybe they're American. Maybe they apply to the state of Florida. Okay? Maybe they apply to a federal employment environment as opposed to BC. Okay, so you want to be really sensitive and cautious about quickly downloading a policy and updating it with your company name and a few key facts and then sending it out. Done. And lastly, there's been lots of questions growing around the use of AI and ChatGPT, for example. You can easily get a template policy from ChatGPT. But again, coming back to issues of credibility, you don't necessarily know that it is correct It's a great starting point, gives you lots of food for thought. But I always recommend if you're going to use something like that, that you bring it back and have an in-depth conversation with an employment lawyer or an HR consultant to really talk through the specifics of whether or not it's most appropriate for you and how it can be edited better. All right. And so with that, let me just look over to the questions. Harjot, you have a question that's off topic. So I'm going to take a read on that as I transition to our final slide and we open it up now. Catalina and I would be happy to take any other questions that might be coming through. So let's see. Off topic questions about vacation. Catalina, you might want to weigh in on this one.
It's really off topic, John. Yeah. But the BC employment standards, the employment standards branch has a very solid website that talks about vacation and what to do. If the person does not want to take their vacation, all I tell you is an employer has an obligation to ensure that people take the time off. Thank you so much for your question. If you have a company that operates in different provinces, do you need a different policy for each province? You do need to make sure that the policy that you roll out comply with the requirements in each province. I have worked for organizations that have operations in various provinces, and we have always found a way to have one template or one policy that works everywhere. Most provinces really require basically the same, where requirements are very specific and different is at the federal level. So if you're a bank, an airline, telecommunications, you're going to have very specific requirements. Now, important to keep in mind, there is a consultation process going on right now by the government of British Columbia to try and roll out a regulation about bullying and harassment. And the consultation process has started. It doesn't mean that there's going to be any new regulation anytime soon. But from what I know of that consultation process, the province is inclined to put forward a regulation that looks very much like the regulation under the Canada Labor Code that makes bullying and harassment policies a little bit more complex than what they are now. But that's not something that's not a today problem. And if you roll out a policy with compliance today, then you have the basics to then adjust to whatever changes. Is there a suite of policies that every business should have? Yes, there is. There are policies that are mandatory by law. You need a privacy policy. Under privacy legislation, every organization needs to inform their employees how they're going to collect, use, and disclose their personal information. So that you need. And you need your bullying and harassment policy. Those are the two that are mandatory. Others are really nice to have because, again, they're going to set the standards and they're going to guide you on how to do things. Depending on your organization, you may want to have an overtime policy. You may want to have a scheduling policy. You may want to have a use of technology policy. Right? So it depends on your workplace.
We have another one here. Does WorkSafe BC have an expectation or limitation as to how quickly an experience of bullying and harassment is reported? Does it have to be reported to the employer first, or can it be taken directly to WCB if it is the employer who's doing the bullying?
So what WorkSafe BC will do when they receive a concern of bullying and harassment is they're going to ask the employee, have you disclosed this to your employer? And if the person says no, WorkSafe BC is going to tell the employer that's where you need to start. Because WorkSafe BC is enforcing compliance by the employer with their obligations. So, right, they're not there to do the work of the employer. I haven't looked at the issue of fines in a while, so I don't want to speak to that. What I have seen in my practice, again, is that WorkSafe BC will always work towards ensuring compliance. So they will give the employer the opportunity to create the policy, or if they have the policy and they haven't investigated, to investigate. But you will also, here's a situation that you might find yourself into. You may have an employee who is making a claim for mental distress benefits under WorkSafe PC. So because of the bullying and harassment, the person is unable to continue to be at work. And that's a claim that's covered under WorkSafe PC. Don't forget, WorkSafe PC is an insurance scheme by which the employer pays a premium in order for there to be coverage of certain events, which are accidents in the workplace or sickness resulting out of an occupational issue in the workplace, right? And so bullying and harassment can lead to the inability to work. And sometimes when employees make a claim for mental distress benefits, then WorkSafe PC is going to do their own investigation of the bullying and harassment incident, which may be running parallel to your investigation of the bullying and harassment incident, right? And it gets people scratching their head, but the purposes are different. You are investigating for the purpose of complying with your obligations under WorkSafe PC, the act, the regulations, your own policy. You committed that you're going to look into these incidents and impose consequences. WorkSafe PC is investigating for the purpose of determining if the person's entitled to those benefits. Huh? And so sometimes people who are called as witnesses, they're like, but why are you calling me as an investigator? I just spoke to WorkSafe PC yesterday. Why are you calling me, right? So it does create confusion, but there's a reason for the parallel stream. We have Rebecca asking, what is the burden of proof for an accusation of bullying and harassment for the employee and the potential defense for the employer? So when somebody claims bullying and harassment, any of us, the burden of proof is that of a balance of probabilities. What does that mean? If I put up my hand and I say I have been bullied by so-and-so, I need to demonstrate that that happened more likely than not, right? I have to make everything I can to show that what I say happened. Now, an investigator, and if that is someone within management and someone within HR, also has an obligation to be proactive, right? So if the person didn't mention any text messages, but you think the text messages, ask the question. The investigator needs to ask the question, are there any text messages? Let me look at the company scheduling for that week and see if that person was here, right? But it is a balance of probabilities. If on a balance of probabilities, the person, the complainant, cannot say that what happened, then the investigator may conclude that the complaint is unsubstantiated, right? Now, the potential defense for the employer, I mean, the employer doesn't have a defense per se. They have an obligation to investigate and impose appropriate consequence, right? If what you mean is when the allegation is against the manager, right? What that manager needs to do is, again, provide their version of events. They don't have the burden of proof, right? But the burden of proof is on the complainant, but every piece of evidence, every fact, every piece of the puzzle that they can provide will help the investigator establish what actually happened and whether there was bullying and harassment. Don't get me wrong, a lot of times I have had respondents, so the person who's accused of bullying and harassment, say, yes, I said that, but I said that for a reason, and here's the context. And this is why this is not bullying or harassment. I was right to say this. Yeah. So sometimes you won't have a conflict as to what happened. What you will have is to determine if what happened breached the policy, yes or no, because the person knew or should have known it would be intimidating. Yeah.
Really good questions. I think what we find here is all these nuances around what it is we're trying to solve and answer. And there's no dumb question. Every organization is going to have their own twist and turn on it. And I would encourage people to continue asking these questions rather than assuming what we've got is enough, or my version of events or my understanding of the process is reality. Yeah. Because that continues to evolve and change.
Yeah. And if there are no other questions, I would just build on a point that Mandie made around communication. Communicate your policy. All the suggestions that Mandie made were amazing. If you can get people to sign off on the policy and you have a record of everybody who who said that they read the policy and they signed it. That's how you can hold people accountable. I see that somebody's asking, can an employee instruct employees who are having a conflict to solve it between themselves? You cannot instruct people to do that. I mean, you can suggest it, right? But but if the conflict on its face may be bullying and harassment, if the two employees are unable to resolve it, then your obligations start of actually now, okay, so between the two of you guys, why don't you try and see if you can resolve this? Okay, well, you can't. Okay, so now I have to take a look at what is it that happened, right? And don't forget, not everything requires a massive investigation. Sometimes as a manager, you sit with one person, you listen to what they have to say, you sit with the other person, you listen to what you have to say, and you may come up with a, you know what, this is unacceptable, Catalina. I'm hearing what you have to say, but that's not how we do things around here. And then, and here's the policy, and I think that's a breach of the policy, and boom, you impose discipline. Not everything requires something massive. Yeah? And yes, there will be a copy of the presentation slides. And I go back to, you can ask people to resolve the conflict themselves, but if also as an organization you want to commit to giving people the tools to resolve conflict, I think that goes a long way, and we will be delighted to partner with you on doing that.
Well, it looks like it's working. You're very welcome, Shara. I'm glad the information has been really helpful. If anyone has more particular questions or follow-up or things that aren't front of mind right now, you'll certainly have an opportunity to connect with Surrey Board of Trade and or Catalina and myself. I know that the plan is to share the slide deck and the video recording for those who were registered today, as well as the contact information for both of us.
Okay, so thank you, Mandie and Catalina, for being with us today and sharing your insights. We will be sending you the recording and the facilitator's contact information after the session. Many more of these type of sessions are coming up, so be sure to check our website at businessinsurrey.com. Make it a great business day, and you may leave the meeting.
Thank you, Rana. Bye, Mandie. Take care.
Thank you both. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.